Welcome to the High Capacity Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Chan, a fellow at Brookings. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my guest, Tu Li, one of the absolute best experts on China's EV and automotive industry. He's spent years working in Detroit, in Silicon Valley, including working for Apple on their supply chains. Then he later moved to China, where he spent over a decade working with Ford and a number of Chinese startups. Now he's the founder and managing director of Sino Auto Insights, a global tech consultancy focused on transportation and mobility. He's also the co-host of the podcast China EVs and More with Lei Xing, and the author of the SAI Weekly newsletter, both of which I highly recommend. Thank you so much, Tu, and thank you for coming on the show.
Kyle, thanks for having me.
So I thought we would start with the technology. And there's this view out there that Chinese EVs are getting popular because they're cheap, that their affordability is sort of the main thing that gives them that edge. But we both know that they're actually packed full of technology and cool features, a lot of stuff that you won't find elsewhere, like megawatt charging or fridges or even theater systems built into the cars themselves. And I was wondering if you could call out a few interesting features, maybe even things that you saw recently at CES, stuff that would help our American audience especially realize what they're missing.
Well, in addition, you stole my thunder a little bit because I was going to mention a few of those things already. Companies like BYD, they have drones on top of their vehicles to do selfies while they're driving in their car. Also karaoke, very unique to China. An anecdote of that is that back in the day, a couple of years ago, Tesla sold a microphone for their vehicles in China. Nowhere else did they sell microphones. And it sold out within, I think, a week. So, but, the emphasis on the unique technology, battery swapping is a major, major thing. And it's successful in China. People kind of poo-poo it around the rest of the world, but there's a couple of different reasons it works in China. Number one, because of the density of most of the cities and, the size of the vehicle market. And it might not make sense in a Europe where there's 300, 400,000 people, but in a city like Shanghai where there's 25 million, Beijing, 23, 22 million people, if there's enough Neos, then it makes sense to have battery swapping. And then the second thing that you had mentioned, kind of the ultra fast charging. Last year, I can't believe I'm saying last year, but in April, right after the auto show, BYD had a little gathering and they showed off the mega charging, the ultra fast mega charging. So it's, there was a marketing term that they had used in Chinese, but it effectively translates to as fast as gas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's important here is that let's also talk about intelligent driving because in the United States, we think of FSD. Some people might think of Super Cruise and Blue Cruise, but what other options out there for intelligent driving? No one else is really offering it from a brand name standpoint. But if we look at the China market, there's XPeng, XPeng has XNGP, Neo has NOP, and you had mentioned the podcast. So Lei and I 2 years ago drove an XPeng G9 from Beijing to Shenzhen. 90% of the miles were using their L2 Plus system, and then last year we took a Neo ET5, and we only battery swapped, and we used their Level 2 Plus system for about 90% of those miles, and then BYD last year drops a bomb, and their system is actually called God's Eye, and they're offering it as standard for 20 of their 22 models. So it's not only that these vehicles have these great technologies, is that people are talking, companies talk about democratizing technology, but that's what BYD just did. And that might have pulled in intelligent driving to the rest of the world by 10 years because BYD is in over 100 countries. And so we're going to look back at this time, even though there's a huge price war in China and the Chinese government's talking about involution. I think in the automotive space globally, we're going to look back at this time as some of the most innovative time in the history of transportation.
It's a really, really exciting time to see the whole industry transform. And you just came back from CES, and there were an unusual number of Chinese EVs represented there, showing off their latest wares, showing off new capabilities, new features. Yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to highlight any of those, anything that you learned while you're out there.
So there were two major OEMs that were featuring at CES. That's Geely and Great Wall Motors. Now there's another company called Dream E, who is the Dyson of China. They also showed off. Yes. So, like intelligent high-end vacuum. They have one of the biggest booths at CES. Look up Dream E, and they showed off their electric vehicle.
They've got an EV now.
Yes. And it's supposed to be a ultra premium competitor to Bugatti type of vehicle, but at a much cheaper price point. And, it just points to the ambitiousness of the Chinese. And the two main languages outside of English that I heard walking around all the convention halls was Korean and Mandarin.
Wow.
And we talk about the politics and kind of the relationship challenges between the United States and China, but that's not stopping the businesses from wanting to be players in the United States, or at least exposing U.S. and Western media to what's out there from China.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that's an important point to make, just because as it seems like things are being more restrictive, you're not seeing that at the ground level here in the United States.
Yeah.
And one of the things that is really important that you and I talked about offline is that Ash Sutcliffe, who's the head of international PR for Geely Holdings, he had a quick chat with John McElroy, who's an Autoline journalist or automotive journalist legend here in Michigan. They sat in a Lincoln Co. vehicle, and Ash said that Geely will be in the U.S. market within the next 36 months. So the countdown clock for the legacy automakers is now ticking.
I mean, that is a stunning, stunning announcement. And, we think about all the barriers that have been put up, whether it's 100% tariffs from the U.S. on Chinese EVs, or whether we think about the connected vehicle rules, worried about data flowing through EVs. Despite all of that, it's fascinating to see that a company like Geely says, we're going to do it. We're going to find a way. And, I'm curious to see how the U.S. automakers react to that kind of throwing down the gauntlet.
Well, if you think about Geely, they're probably, if you look at their portfolio of brands, they're the most international. They have Volvo, they have Polestar. They have a factory in South Carolina that's currently underutilized. So this makes sense when you think about it from a financial standpoint, because if I'm a Chinese OEM with the uncertainty of the U.S. entering the U.S. market because the current administration is kind of back and forth a little bit on its policies, it would make sense that Geely has first mover advantage because they already have a facility here and they don't need to invest billions of dollars in building a greenfield factory or a brownfield or something like that. But, all that being said, as a Michigander and someone who grew up working at the traditional automotive companies, I'm fearful for the U.S. automakers. But as a consumer who doesn't like the direction of the MSRP or the manufacturer suggested retail price of cars now in the United States tipping over to $50,000, we need more competition at the low end. And I think the Chinese will bring that.
Yeah. Speaking of some of these Chinese companies, I was just wondering if you could take a step back and help us sort of navigate the landscape of Chinese EV companies, all these different brands. People might have heard about some of them, BYD, Geely, some of the newer ones like Xpeng and Neo. There's sort of this proliferation of brands. Now we have even Dreamy coming on with their own EV. Xiaomi, which I remember when Xiaomi was a air purifier and smartphone maker, and now they make really, really cool EVs. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could kind of give us like what are sort of the buckets of Chinese EV companies and automakers that we should be following?
Yeah, no problem. Great question. So in China, there are state-owned enterprises or SOEs, and the requirement the Chinese government had made 40 years ago or 45 years ago was that if the foreign automakers wanted to come to China, they needed to create a joint venture with some of these state-owned enterprises. So some of the strongest state-owned enterprises are SAIC or Shanghai Auto, GAC Guangzhou Auto, FAW First Auto Works, and they're strong because they're all located in different parts of China, and notable joint ventures are SAIC with Volkswagen, SAIC with General Motors, FAW with Volkswagen. And when we look at those guys, they do sell in the millions of units. Okay. So historically, there's these state-owned enterprises, and technically there's only 3 independent, automakers in China. And, loosely, because their home markets or their home where they're headquartered, they get a lot of support from, like BYD is in Shenzhen. They get a lot of support from the city of Shenzhen. An example would be if you go to Shenzhen right now, I believe every single bus is electric, and most of them, if not all of them, have BYD badge on them. The taxis in Shenzhen, and we're talking tens of thousands of them, all BYD, all electric. So BYD, Great Wall Motors, and Geely are technically independent. Okay, and if we think about BYD, Great Wall Motors, and Geely, they also are in the millions of units of sales. BYD is such a compelling and interesting story because less than 5 or 6 years ago, they were at 700,000 units globally.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say this year, but last year they hit 4.6 million units. So if you can think about, and what's really impressive, Kyle, is that not only did they have that demand, but they could build to that demand. Okay. Because they didn't leave anything on the bone. They made sure that they were able to accommodate that demand because they're vertically integrated. So they fab their own silicon, they make their own batteries. And so they're a unique animal, but you're seeing the Teslas, the Rivians, Ford. I was at a Ford press event yesterday. They said they're bringing mostly everything in-house. So this is a trend of control. Okay.
Yeah.
And they see that BYD is able to control a lot more because they do these things in-house. But just like Apple is a very unique company, BYD has a formula that works. With all that being said, Great Wall Motors, Geely, and then BYD, they're in the millions of units. I would also put Chery into that mix because they have several million units of sales. And then we get into some of the independents, some of the companies that are very recent, the startups. So the Neos, the Xpengs, the Li Autos, they're in the hundreds of thousands of units of sales. They're primarily only electric or EREV, extended range electric vehicle. In the United States, they might call them REEVs, but in China, they call them EREVs. And then Li Auto, up until last year or 2 years ago, were only selling EREVs. Now they also sell electric vehicles. The most famous or infamous probably being the Li Auto Mega, that wedge-looking MPV. And one of the technology companies that you had mentioned earlier, Xiaomi, which is around 14 or 15 years old. I remember because in 2010, I was living in Beijing when they launched as a company. Their automotive division is only a little over 4 years old. So they've thrown a monkey wrench into the market just because they have 2 products and they've hit over 400,000 units of sales in 4 years.
That's incredible.
To give you a quick comparison and contrast, Xpeng and Neo, which are closer to 10 or 11 years old, are hitting the 400,000 unit mark in sales, with many more products in the market. So I'm not trying to oversimplify this, but that's kind of the buckets that I would look at it. And there are still brands that are launching, as you had mentioned, Dream E with new vehicles, and so that's what makes the China market so ultra competitive. One other point that I would make is that most cars, let's say over 85%, are under 350. Most cars that are purchased are under 350,000 RMB, which is less than $40,000 or $45,000. So these companies, most of them live in the mass market. Okay. And that's what differentiates the China market. Well, if we go to the premium side, the average buyer of a Mercedes or a Cadillac is 20 to 25 years younger than anyone in Europe or the United States. Because of that age difference, they embrace technology, they embrace digital much more than their counterparts in the United States and Europe. So, because if you're a 35-year-old versus a 55-year-old, you have different needs, and your experience with technology is completely different. And so that's another reason the China market is much different than the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I mean, there's just like such a huge range of models coming online, and all the way from the ultra luxury side, you have the competitors, like you mentioned, to Bugatti or Lamborghini, and all the way down to the mass market side. You have basically minivans for families. You have the full range. I mean, it's sort of whatever you can think of. It's there. I want to come back to this comment you made about like Xiaomi being so fast at going from 0 cars ever made to suddenly becoming a major player in the industry, and having some of the most sought after models like the Su 7 and now the U7. And I wanted to kind of read back to you a quote from that I found so striking that you had said on your China EVs and More podcast, where you said that Chinese EV brands are acting more and more like consumer electronics. So if they're not seeing the sales they want with a certain model, they can go back and refresh the model in like 12 to 14 months. And you said the automotive space is starting to mimic the technology space now. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that. What did you mean by, cars are becoming like consumer electronics?
So let me qualify that first, because what I don't like is the comparison and a lot of media outlets saying it's a mobile phone on wheels. Okay, because it's not. Okay, different use cases. Your mobile phone can't run you over and kill you. Okay, that is the biggest difference. And I think oversimplifying now the complexity of the technology and the digital and the software. Yes, we're getting to that level, but they're changing the game. One of the big ways they're doing that is, and traditionally in automotive, you would design and engineer a component, right? Like a door handle or something like that. Then you would build 3, 4, 5 prototypes of it, and you would test it that way. And the Chinese are doing simulations. Okay. Toyota, best in class before the Chinese came in and kind of changed the game. They would go, their product development cycles like 36 or 38 months or something like 40 months. Clean sheet to job one in about 4 years. The Chinese can do it in 12, let's say 14 to 16 months. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The platform is pretty basic and universal, so they can shorten it and extend it without creating a brand new platform. That simplifies things. And then the top hat, a lot of that is just the design, right? And the most important part of the top hat, or the top of the vehicle where the seats are and everything, is going to be the software and the integration. Because the other thing that I don't like, and I'm just getting on my soapbox, Kyle, is the term software-defined vehicle. As an Apple alum, How come we don't say software-defined phone? Why don't we say software-defined computer? Because that's not what it does. It enables great design. And it's the integration of the hardware and software that creates the experience. Okay, I'll give you a quick example. We're used to our Android phones and our iPhones where the latency is effectively zero. If I touch the screen, something happens. A big challenge that the automakers had early days when they started becoming software-defined vehicles was as simple as the latency on their touchscreen. Because what would happen is you and I are used to, okay, the responsiveness is immediate on our phones. But when we go to our Volkswagen, it might take a half a second or a third of a second. And by that time, you or I have pressed it again twice.
Yeah.
And so when it finally catches up, it's 3 layers deep as opposed to the 1 layer that we wanted it to be. So those are kind of the simple things. Again, as a ex-technology Silicon Valley guy who worked at arguably the coolest design hardware software integration company in the world, those are the things that the Chinese companies really lean into. One important note, Li Xiang, who's the founder CEO of Li Auto, Li Bin, who's the founder CEO of NIO, and He Xiaopeng, who's the founder CEO of XPeng, all started as technology guys. They all made their billions and their wealth from technology companies. So their mindset is not, okay, how big of a factory, how much capacity, how many components in managing supply chains. They looked at it from a technology standpoint or through a technology lens first. Then they learned how to manufacture shit.
Yeah.
And so that's the difference between the current legacies and some of the, and you could argue that with a Tesla and a Rivian a little bit too. So.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. In some ways, the term software-defined vehicles kind of says a lot about the people who use that word. Where it's like, you think about first, a car doesn't have software, or it's not a high priority, and then you add it, sort of after the fact. And it's like, no. You're talking about now some of these Chinese EV companies where they are sort of born technology companies. Right. And they build cars and they build these sophisticated, I don't call them, like, it's more than cars, it's more than obviously consumer electronic, but like these machines that are responsive and that can do a whole bunch of things beyond just get us from point A to point B, which they also do.
And to hammer home the point of how fast things move is if they launch a vehicle with X or Y features that aren't being used or is really buggy, they can send an OTA update within a week or 2 weeks. And they're super responsive because they know through the data whether it's being used properly and or whether it's buggy. And then they'll flash the software. And next thing, and you don't have to go into the dealership to do that. It'll just flash the software and then you don't have it anymore. And this is brand new. And it creates, because the traditional automotive, it was like they had refreshes, and those refreshes were annual, and they had minor refreshes. Every year we're improving 1 or 2 things, and then every 5 years they would call it a major refresh where sheet metal would change, design would change. This is a game changer because maybe the vehicle physically stays the same, but the features, the performance, and some of the technology is different just by flashing the software.
Yeah. So when you're buying that car, you are kind of buying the future potential capabilities that might be coming online later on through these, over-the-air updates. So
a specific example is NIO put in a silicon that, in anticipation of a software update 12 months later or 6 months later, was kind of dormant. The performance was dormant. But they knew that they were going to, through their product roadmap, they knew that, OTA update number 3 was going to allow them to use the performance of those chips at an optimum level. So in anticipation, they put those chips in without being able to fully utilize them. So think of the effect on residual, right? Because traditional analog vehicles, the residual just does this. But if if the companies are aware enough of what their product roadmap is, they can create, depending on whether the cost is high or not, they could anticipate that we're going to increase the value of this vehicle at year 3 because we're going to offer these new features that weren't available when you purchased the vehicle. So those are kind of really new opportunities that people are having a hard time getting their heads around.
So next I want to ask you about manufacturing and changes in the auto industry. So what's going on in China, and how is this changing the rest of the auto industry outside?
So let's start with the 100,000 foot level and then get down to the 20,000 foot level. The China passenger vehicle market has been the number one market in the world since 2009. They took the crown from the United States. Let's say 2025. I don't think all the numbers are out, so I'm just going to give you some estimates. Around 25 million units were sold in China, about 15.5 to 16 million units sold in the United States, around 13 million in Europe, in the EU. And I'm saying, again, these are estimates. And last year, John Elkin, who's the chairman of Stellantis, he was like, the China market could be the size of the US and European market combined in 2025. I don't think that happened, but it got close. And the take rate of NEVs. So China uses a specific acronym, NEVs. It stands for New Energy Vehicles. And it is basically battery electric vehicles or BEVs, plug-in hybrids, which are PHEVs, and then FCEVs or fuel cell. Fuel cell is a rounding error. So let's just say NEVs equals battery electric and plug-in hybrids. That take rate was around 50% last year. So 1 out of every 2 vehicles in China was an NEV. And if we divide 25 million into, or divide 25 million by 2, the electric vehicles sold in China is almost the size of the European market itself.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's a scale thing, right? We talk about manufacturing. Manufacturing is all about scale, creating economies of scale and creating leverage against our suppliers so that we can push costs down. And Kyle, if you're a company that's buying 4 of something and I'm a company buying 1 of something from the same supplier, who do you think is going to have a cost advantage? Okay. And, you know, people always talk about labor rates being cheaper, blah, 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 but labor rates are actually going up. And my friend, I was told that right now, engineers in Shanghai at some of the OEMs, their salaries are about as much as somebody in Michigan.
Yeah.
So it's not, you probably know more about this than I do. Okay. So the salaries, it's not some step function that it's much cheaper labor rates in China. They make up for that with automation happening at the manufacturing sites. I went to FE2, which is the factory where NIO builds most of their vehicles, or some of their vehicles, in Hefei last year. And parts of the factory were dark because it was pretty much all automated. Only the last part, final assembly, there's people walking around. But, you know, it's less and less, I'll admit that. But I think people in the West still think that there's like 1 million people on an assembly line putting one part together. And I would argue, as someone living in the Midwest where the UAW is very strong, there's more manual labor in U.S. Factories than there is in China. And then, you know, let's address the elephant in the room, the overcapacity issue. I moved, so I lived in China from 2009 to 2022. I moved back here 3 years ago. Day one, I land and, you know, they know I'm a car guy. They know I'm a tech guy. And they're like, oh, yeah, consolidation is right around the corner. And so, you know this as a researcher, consolidation has been talked about in the China market across different sectors for forever.
Right.
Okay. What people should understand, and again, I'm sure you've written about this in past newsletters, so they should reference some of your data and your insights, is that state-owned enterprises, their job is to keep people employed. It's not actually to be profitable. Now, if that's an outcome, then great. But, and how do provincial leaders, how do, state or city leaders get promoted? Through increasing tax revenue and more employment. Okay. And that's kind of and I'd love your input on this, because I think at the central government level, they do see the concerns. They do see the risk with some of this overcapacity. And then they communicate it to the provincial level or the local level, a local government level. But there's this, it's not aligned. The incentives aren't aligned. And it creates challenges.
Yeah. You get this kind of coordination problem where, at a national level, you want to build up a robust automotive industry that's, cutting edge and very competitive, and you might not want everyone to be replicating and producing at such large volumes. But at the local level, you have each of the local governments, the provincial governments, municipal governments, thinking about their factories in their jurisdictions and the workers that those factories employ and the revenue that those factories bring in. And they're like, well, we don't want to be the ones to give it up. Maybe someone else can do it, but not us. So it's an interesting sort of multi-level sort of game theory issue.
And it pushes against the consolidation needs. And I think that's what's important. But the Chinese government does recognize that there needs to be less competition, because the competition right now is so fierce that no one's profitable. I mean, there are a handful of companies that I think from an accounting standpoint, you could say they're profitable, but from a real dollar standpoint, everybody's kind of struggling.
So where do you think this is heading then, looking into 2026 or the years ahead? What's going to happen with this overcapacity problem in China, and how might it spill over to the rest of the world?
It already has. The China automakers, and let's say the automakers that manufacture in China, because GM also exports, Ford exports, Tesla exports. So the China market is not an export hub for Chinese brands. It's an export hub for automotive brands, full stop. And I think one of the things that the narratives that is inaccurate is that it's only Chinese brands that are exporting, and that's not the case. And so the tariffs in the United States for Chinese exported vehicles, that also affects the U.S. legacies. Okay, because there's a brand that GM co-owns called Wuling. They rebadge some of those products as Chevys and ship them to Latin America. Ship them to South America. And Ford booked $900 million of revenue or profit out of the China market last year. Their vehicle sales is very low. They did a lot of that profit through exporting. And I think it's very important because, again, there's, let's say 65 to 80 million units of vehicle sales globally. If we think of the numbers that I just mentioned about EU, US, and China, that's over 50%, closer to 60% of total volume annually. And so it's those three markets in, more so China, that is dictating the pace. What's happened recently is that the legacy automakers who were making money hand over fist with their ICE vehicles being manufactured alongside their joint venture partners, they've been eaten away at market share because BYD can build you a PHEV or a BEV at the same price with better features and the features that attract the young Chinese consumer. Okay, so if anything, the severity of overcapacity is on the ICE side right now, not as much on the EV side. But when we look at EVs, not only are the Chinese OEMs and EV makers the top brands, but when we move over to the battery side, which is the largest portion of cost for manufacturing an electric vehicle, two companies own over 50% market share. Two Chinese companies own over 50% market share. That's CATL and BYD. And so there tends to be a lot of capacity on the battery side as well. Now, and this is where you and I should just kind of have a dialogue, because again, exports have never been higher. We're seeing Mexico, Brazil, the United States, Canada create protectionism through tariffs. And so everybody's kind of expecting that, and they're playing defense against it. Now, I believe that tariffs only hurt the consumers in the markets that they're launched in, because, I want the most innovative products, the coolest products in the United States market at the lowest price. And with that, we need competition. And so in 2026, there probably does need to be a reconciliation of capacity, because if the pressure release valve used to be, I'm going to export it. But now, because of the protectionism, the number of exports is going to either flatten out or even reduce a little bit. And then in the two different, the companies that I think are different than everybody else so far from the China brand standpoint is Chery and BYD, because they have manufacturing outside of China, like significant manufacturing, whereas everyone else is pretty much, I just ship from China.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but if I build capacity in Spain or Poland, it doesn't help with my overcapacity in China. That's still an issue that I need to address. So with protectionism in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, and again, the reason it matters in the United States is because it's the second largest passenger vehicle market in the world. And then there's going to be more pressure to export to Africa, to Southeast Asia, where the protectionism isn't as strong. And there are no national brands. There are no national OEMs to take share from or take jobs from. And I think that's kind of the important thing. But if we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, yes, it's a massive market, but individual countries within that market, because Southeast Asia, like Europe, is many countries. It's not just one country with one language. It's hard to add up 15 countries worth of market share to equal what you could do in the United States alone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So
and the complexity
of so crucial.
Yeah. And it's just very difficult because there's language barriers, there's culture barriers, there's, currency differences that make it much more complex to enter Southeast Asia than it is in the United States, although there are political considerations and cost considerations there.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Speaking of sort of like what happens to the global auto industry as we see more and more sort of, especially these Chinese EVs, find their way into overseas markets, I was wondering if you could talk about what existing automakers outside of China might do to take advantage of Chinese EV technology to maybe form partnerships. I mean, there's a couple high-profile ones like Volkswagen working with XPeng, or Ford using and licensing battery technology from CATL. So there's some interesting ways in which it doesn't have to just be sort of this like brutal bloodbath where Chinese EVs crush the rest of the competition, as like so many headlines are sort of framing the future as. Are there ways in which the industry itself is sort of reconfiguring, and might other parts be able to take advantage of some of these technologies and manufacturing processes coming out of China?
Great question. You brought up one particular partnership. It's more of an investment. Volkswagen invested and acquired about a 5% share in XPeng. And this year in 2026 will be the beginning of that joint venture, because Volkswagen will launch in the China market XPeng IP'd electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids into the China market. Now they're using last version of the platform, which is kind of weird because XPeng has a more mature platform that they're currently using on their vehicles, but that has global implications. And if we look at the Europeans in particular, the politics seem less because Stellantis is also very heavily invested in a Chinese partner, Leap Motor, 19% owned by Stellantis, Leap Motor is. And so they also have a distribution or sales distribution agreement to help Leap Motor in Europe. And so these are practical partnerships and opportunities for these companies to really continue to thrive together. Because, but you could also look at it as the glass is half empty by saying the European automakers waved the white flag and said, I can't get to the level of software development that I need to, the level of user experience design that I need to without the help of a Chinese partner. The US, I think part of that, because I'm sure we're reading about it as well. There's been a ton of backlash about the Ford CATL partnership. But again, it's very practical. I mentioned earlier, CATL is one of the largest, or it's the largest battery manufacturer. They have 37% market share, and they are experts in LFP manufacturing. So there's different chemistries. You know that. It's probably out of scope for this conversation, but LFP is the dominant battery chemistry for Chinese electric vehicles. And the only way the Western automakers are really going to compete on price with the Chinese is if they use LFP as well, because before that they were using a much more expensive chemistry, NCM or NMC, however acronym you want to use, that uses nickel and cobalt, which are much more expensive. They're longer range, but again, if we're trying to make sub $35,000 cars, we need the LFP technology. But I'm hoping that, and again, the individual OEMs need to make decisions that's best for them, but it's too political still in the United States to announce something like that. But Kyle, if we know that the Chinese want to enter, we should. Why don't we do a joint venture requirement? With the Chinese, because they did that to us in 45 years ago, and a smaller and smaller group, the implication that they were forced to do this, they were forced to do that. Nobody forced Volkswagen to enter the China market. No one forced GM to enter they signed that agreement, the joint venture agreement.
They made a lot of money along the way. And in fact, I remember looking at the data for Volkswagen, like the year that they had that big scandal, the Dieselgate in Germany, and they got hit really hard. But in China, their sales there, their profits there, basically carried them through that period. And I think a similar story with GM when they were going through their tough period after the financial crisis.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to take sides. I'm just trying to keep score, being objective with my opinion, and that's the God's honest truth, because they've been in the market for 35, 40 years. For a while, they're booking $2-3 billion of profit from the China market. And I think a little bit of it is they're busy counting their money, and then the Chinese kind of, so IP theft, right? At least in the automotive space, if there was IP theft on ICE powertrains, why did China need why did the Chinese brands need to pivot to electric vehicles? Because they knew they were never going to catch up to the Western automakers on powertrain design and engineering. Okay. And then the Chinese government took a step back in 2009 and incentivized manufacturing of batteries, of electric vehicles. And so that's called long-term planning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's something the United States could take a lesson from, like this industrial strategy. And some people in the United States will look at that as a bad word. I don't look at it as a bad word at all. As someone that lives in the heart of manufacturing for the United States, there needs to be an industrial policy for us if we're going to compete long term with China.
Yeah. Definitely, I totally agree, and I think the old days of hoping that American cars would just be wanted the world over, the brands would just dominate, and you could kind of coast are long over. Before I want to get to smart driving and robotaxis, but just before we get there, I did want to ask you about hybrids and about whether this is sort of like a transition strategy for Chinese EV makers and maybe the global auto industry. It seems like hybrids are popular in the China market, but also in Europe, in the US, and especially in much of the world where you don't have the kind of EV charging infrastructure that you might have in, say, Norway. So that might be an outlier. But in the rest of the one, and then we haven't even gotten to sort of global south, where it could be sort of even less developed. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had like views on the role of hybrids, whether you saw this as a continuing market or a temporary sort of phase in this broader industry evolution.
So, I think when we think of hybrid, we think of Toyota as Westerners, because the Prius has been manufactured for so many years. Okay. But we think of the Prius kind of from a traditional standpoint. We get a few miles of non-gas range, but in China, the hybrids or the plug-in hybrids that are being launched nowadays, you might get 150 to 200 miles of range.
Yeah,
And there are hybrids and then there's EREV. So they're different but same. They're different but same. So an EREV technically doesn't the gas engine never powers the wheels. It only recharges the battery. Okay. And the purists will say, well, that's not a clean energy vehicle. And I'm not one of those people that wants to debate that. To me, it's a win, right? If I'm not using gas, it's a win. Practically, I was looking at a Cherokee 4xe when I repatriated to the United States as my daily driver because I have kids, so I needed a larger car. It got less than 25 miles. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's what you would call a mild hybrid. But the important thing to remember is that there's dense cities in China, dense cities in a lot of Asia. And we're talking orders of magnitude different than what people outside of New York City think of as dense. San Francisco proper, 700,000. Detroit proper, 700,000. And again, in Beijing, that was probably the size of my neighborhood.
Oh yeah, that's like Haidian district or something.
Right. Yeah, that's nothing. So hybrid use is really practical in the United States, where people are much more truck heavy, and there's a portion of consumer that really does need a clean energy vehicle that has longer range. And so a battery alone that has, let's say, an estimated range of 300, if somebody puts a heavy load into their truck, that goes down to 150, 170. Okay. That's in ideal conditions. When we get into the wintertime, that might get down to 100, 90. So there are practical applications where a hybrid does make sense, right? Because if the effective range is 700, if I put a heavy load in my truck or SUV and it goes down to 300 or 400, that's still a win.
Yeah.
And you're seeing Dodge, you're seeing Ford. Ford is eliminating the battery electric F-150 Lightning with a PHEV. And there is a bridge, because if you think about first mover or early adopters, maybe those people have matured in the United States because they have their Teslas, they have I am a Ioniq 5 owner. So yeah. I'm a BEV owner too, but for what you said, people more in the suburbs, more in rural, more that need different use cases. Yeah, that's that bridge until battery swapping comes along, more charging infrastructure comes along, faster charging infrastructure comes along. All these things are happening. The one thing that is really important in kind of a binary thing that I want to point out is that the world is moving to clean energy vehicles, full stop. Whether the United States wants to recognize that, it's going to make our companies less competitive across the board. Because the question then becomes, and again, this is probably oversimplistic, do we want a profitable Ford that is only selling an F-150 in the United States, or do we want a profitable Ford that's a global company?
Yeah.
I think it's important to recognize that, that we're prideful as Americans And to say that another country is doing something better than us, I think there's a portion of the United States that doesn't want to admit that.
Yeah.
And someone who is an American who has lived abroad, I can tell you that it is kind of difficult. It's a difficult pill to swallow. But my first job, Kyle, was in a factory for GM. And so I've driven these cars. I've experienced a lot of miles in China behind the wheel of a lot of Chinese cars. Americans would buy them, many of them. And hopefully that scares but motivates Western companies, because that's the key. It can't just scare you. It needs to motivate you in doing better.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the last topic I want to ask you about was kind of related to this global expansion of Chinese EVs, which is the global expansion of Chinese Robotaxis. You have services like WeRide, and Baidu has their Apollo Go, and Pony AI. There's actually quite a number of cities now globally that they're operating across. And then at the same time, I just saw news from CES that Waymo was launching their new autonomous vehicle built on a Zeekr EV. So that's imported from China and sort of then retrofitted with sensors, LiDAR, so it's just sort of an interesting moment right now where on the one hand you have this EV story, and with that you have the robotaxi sort of autonomous driving story happening at the same time. So I just was wondering if you could, share your thoughts on what's happening in this space, and where do you think this is all going?
So I would say 2025 was almost like the second coming out party for robotaxis, because Waymo started marketing quite aggressively that they're going to be entering 20, 30, 40 cities in 26 and 27. And the important thing is that they're entering London, New York, Detroit, which are four-season cities. So there's snow, there's rain, and this means that there's a level of confidence with their technology that they're able to go to these four-season cities. Because what is a key that if you just look at historically up until 24, 25, most of the launches were only in warm weather, one season, two season cities. Arizona, Austin, San Francisco, LA, which doesn't see any snow. Okay. And that should tell you that there's more confidence in their capabilities all around.
Yeah. It doesn't say anything about the drivers, right?
Right. Yeah. And again, to your point, let me also note that, and you know this, but I'll tell your audience, WeRide and Pony are publicly traded in the United States. So whether they enter the United States or not, there's a lot of Western investment dollars in these companies. And so Waymo is by far, to me, still the undisputed champion and leader. People will, the Tesla stands will try to throw in FSD, but I don't see that many cybercabs out on the roads yet, right? So they can talk all they want. They need to show me that Tesla is launching these, because let's just look at a number standpoint. There's over 1,000 Waymo vehicles on the roads all around the world. I think more than 1,000, like more closer to 1,100. And then Baidu is in China has about 1,000, and then WeRide and Pony have a few hundred each. Okay, and not to look at this over simplistically, but that should also give you an indication of the level of capital each of these companies has. Okay. And I don't think that's the case anymore, but Rewind 3 years ago, it was all about the data, which means that the number of pilots and the number of robotaxis created this distinct advantage, all else being equal. Okay. I don't want to get into the vision only versus LiDAR side, but that's an interesting thing. But long tail, robotaxi and autonomy is happening in commercial and then in passenger. Okay. And then what will happen is there'll be specific geofenced areas and specific use cases where level 4 will be available. I was at that presser for Ford yesterday. They said they're going to have level 3 by 2028. GM said they're going to have level 3 by 2028. The difference between level 2 and level 3, because I don't want to this to turn into this autonomous vehicle 101 is that level 2, we're responsible and liable as drivers and owners of the vehicle for any accidents. In level 3, that and I'm generalizing, right? Some of your audience might be start getting all ticky tacky on this stuff. But level 3, the liability changes over to the OEM. Okay. And when we talk level 3, we're not talking, okay, I'm going to press a button, it's going to drive me through the city. Although Teslas do that, but their lawyers don't allow them to say level 3, and they're not as good as a lot of people think they are. Although their FSD is amazing. I'm not trying to take anything away from it. And so what creates an advantage for some of these Chinese companies is that, again, industrial policy. It seems to be a wide embrace nationally of robotaxi companies and pilots. And in Europe, it's starting to happen more and more just because, like you said, the Chinese are entering Europe. So Baidu, that might be, so the London market might be the coolest for robotaxis in the short term because Wave is there. Waymo's going to be there, and Baidu. Okay, so there's a British, American, and a Chinese. And then if you look in the Middle East, again, why the Middle East? Because they're trying to be friendly to Chinese technology and US technology, okay? So Waymo's there, but WeRide's also there. And then why Middle East from a operational standpoint? Because it's a freaking desert and it's sunny all the time. So the challenges of operating a robotaxi are less than a Detroit or a New York City or a Boston. Okay, so there's practical reasons for that. And Waymo is not in China. Baidu is not in the United States. Let's assume that long term, there probably won't be in any significant way. That means that, unfortunately, Europe is kind of a bystander, with the exception of Wave, because there are no European robotaxi companies of any significance that I can think of. Now, commercial trucking, there are a couple players, but on the robotaxi side. So when I say bystanders, I mean they have no horse in the race. Okay, so Waymo and a few of the others. So Zoox has a pilot in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, the wait was 45 minutes, and I was just too busy to. I was disappointed, and the time frame was very limited. But Neuro and Lucid also announced a partnership with Uber. So there are a few other players now in the United States that are showing up, but there's a second level of robotaxi companies, Deep Route, QCraft, and that are also players. But the convergence between robotaxi company and intelligent driving is happening in China much more so than in the West. A company to look out for is Momenta.
Yeah.
They launched 7 years ago. Toyota's investor, GM is an investor. The current Buick Electra with the L2 Plus system in China is using Momenta. So GM is, and we had talked about this offline, if GM thought that Cruise back in the day could have been a universal system for them, or their Super Cruise, they probably wouldn't have invested in I think it was $400 million that GM invested in Momenta. And so we're starting to see the fruits of that labor. But then just over the last 18 months, Momenta has announced partnerships with a ton of Western OEMs. So I would also, when we talk robotaxi, that's kind of the final frontier. I would also look at intelligent driving because NIO has a version, XPeng has a version, Huawei has a set of brands that use its stack. And so we'll start to see that bleed over into other regions. And I think that's kind of what the most interesting thing is, because for autonomy to be widely adopted, we have to create awareness and then we have to build trust.
Yeah.
And the Chinese companies are doing that because they're offering intelligent driving in so many of their vehicles.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, it makes me want to fly out to London or Abu Dhabi and try them all in one space and on the same roads. And we can all meet up for a drink. You take your Waymo, and I'll take my Apollo or my WeRide, and we'll meet up afterwards. So everything is changing very quickly, and it's a very exciting time to see all this. Well. That's all I've got from my end. Thank you two for like a fantastic conversation. I have learned so much from you. If others want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
So as you had mentioned earlier, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of your newsletter as well. And, we had talked about this offline. I think you and I aren't trying to take sides. We're just trying to set up how things are working, and hopefully governments, private enterprises are looking at us as pieces of reliable information and data points for them. And so you can find my newsletter at SAI Weekly or sinoautoinsights.substack.com. I actually had just launched another podcast, so I co-host two podcasts, China EVs and More, and another one called At the Wheel with Joe White, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And this is more focused on North America and Europe than in China. And so, first of all, good luck on this podcast. I know it's going to be super successful. You're going to have super interesting people on it. And, I hope for us to collaborate again in the future, man, because I think you're doing awesome work as well.
Thank you so much, too. It's very, very kind of you to say. Yeah, I absolutely look forward to chatting more in the future. And thank you for coming on the show.
Right on, man. I appreciate you having me and inviting me. And we have to figure out when we're going to meet up in what city and figure out which Robotaxis we're going to take to go grab that drink, right? So
Definitely.
Maybe we can get a few more people and then race to the same bar. I think that would be super fun.
I love it. All right. So I'll just wrap up and say, if you like this episode, please rate and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. You can find episode transcripts and more information on the High Capacity newsletter at high-capacity.com. I'm your host, Kyle Chan. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.